Alright, so today I want to talk about one of the biggest questions that I've seen asked over on a lot of the reptile forums, and that is, should I actually hibernate my snake? And I would say there's a lot of confusion about hibernation, and in this video I want to cover just a few talking points about hibernation and snakes. And the first one I want to talk about is, what is hibernation? And it actually is also called brumation, or overwintering, when it comes to snakes. And essentially the idea about brumation is you're trying to mimic the natural environment of a snake. And a lot of these snakes in the reptile industry, I'd say, like corn snakes, they're pretty much native to a lot of states here in the United States, as well as hognoses are in Colorado here, and garter snakes and a lot of the colubrids. You'll see them actually out in the wild here in the United States. And you might be thinking, what happens to those snakes in the middle of winter? And believe it or not, those snakes actually go through what we know as brumation, kind of a form of hibernation. It's kind of interesting. Alright, so point number 2 is, why would we brumate our snakes? Why would we put them into a brumation or hibernation? And a lot of people will actually argue that it actually helps them to breed. The males are a little more fertile, the females are a little more receptive. A lot of times people say that the females will actually lay larger clutches of eggs coming out of the brumation. And there's also some other arguments where, especially with the larger breeders, they actually put the snakes into a brumation because essentially what you're doing is you're cooling down the snakes and they go off of food, and it's a lot easier as far as the care and the maintenance of the snake. Pretty much you're just kind of shelving the snakes for a while, so you don't really have to really maintain and feed your snakes as much as you would in the regular season. So it saves on costs, it saves on your food bill, and it's a lot of people argue that it's actually good for the snake. Other people will argue that you actually don't need to brumate your snake. As a matter of fact, most people will say that if you just buy a snake that is, in this classification of where you can actually brumate the snakes. Not all snakes can actually brumate, but if you have one that brumates, a lot of times they say if you buy one as a pet, you actually don't need to bring it through this hibernation cycle unless you're actually trying to breed that snake. Alright, so point number 3 is, not all snakes actually brumate. So you have to actually look at the species of the snake, look at the natural environment, and see if the snake can actually handle a cool down period. So for example, this snake around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. These come from West Africa, over in Togo and Benin. And let me tell you, it doesn't really get cold over there, so they don't have a natural cooling cycle over there. So ball pythons definitely will not tolerate going through a brumation. And a lot of the snakes that are native here in the United States, they actually can go through brumation. And a lot of people, what they do is actually kind of group together what we know as colubrids. Colubrids are like your rat snakes, king snakes, milk snakes, and like garter snakes and hognoses. All those actually can withstand, and really it's beneficial to actually go through a brumation cycle for some of those snakes. So you have to really know your snakes. You have to know pretty much down to species, and you have to know for sure that your snake can actually handle the brumation cycle before you start putting your snake through the process of brumation. Alright, so point number 4 is, the cooling ball pythons is not actually considered brumation. So you see a lot of people right before the start of the breeding season, a lot of people will lower the temperature on the ball python like 10 degrees. Especially, well, it really depends on the breeder. Some breeders really kind of lower it more than others. And personally, what I do is I keep the temperatures constant throughout the whole season for ball pythons. But I'd say most people, when they're breeding ball pythons, they tend to lower the ambient temperature about 10 degrees at night and then bring it up in the daytime. Kind of a trigger for breeding. And let me tell you, when you're cooling your ball pythons down, that's not actually considered brumation. That's actually just considered, kind of a cool down trigger for breeding. So you have to really keep in mind that even though you're cooling your ball pythons down, it's not considered brumation. Alright, so point number 5 is that brumation can be dangerous. It can actually kill your snake, believe it or not. And essentially what you're doing is you're cooling down the snake for like a hibernation cycle. And the problem is if you actually feed your snake and then cool it down, it doesn't actually have enough heat to digest the rodent inside the snake. So a lot of people are saying if you actually feed a snake, put it directly into a cooling cycle, into a brumation, you can actually kill it because it really can't digest digest that meal inside the snake. So pretty much the general rule of thumb across the board is if you're putting a snake into brumation, you have to feed it and then wait for 3 or 4 weeks before you actually start cooling down the temperatures into the brumation cycle. All right, number 6 is brumation temperature. And when it comes to temperature, I'd say pretty much across the board, I've seen most people brumate about 50 to 55 degrees for brumation. And I've actually seen some people go as low as 40 to 45, pretty cold for a snake. It's pretty amazing that snakes can live at that temperature. And essentially what I've seen a lot of people do is, especially if you have a lot of colubrids, what they'll do is they'll put it in one room dedicated to colubrids, and then they'll have an air conditioning on a thermostat and just kind of slowly reduce the temperature a little bit every day and stretch it out over like a week or two and slowly reduce that temperature down to your target temperature for brumation. You don't really want to just kind of jump, go from room temperature all the way down to a cold temperature overnight. You want to have a gradual transition. And it's kind of the same way when you're bringing them out of brumation. I've seen a lot of people kind of do slowly out of brumation. I've also seen some people kind of jump back up to just regular temperatures and hot spots pretty much the same day. And I think it really doesn't have that much of an effect if you're bringing the temperatures up, but I'd say it has a little more impact if you're actually cooling them down. You definitely want that gradual transition. All right, so number 7 is brumation time. How long should we brumate our snakes? And I'd say on average, most people brumate about 3 months, which is quite a long time. Essentially what you're doing is you're feeding them their last meal, and then you're giving them like 3 or 4 weeks off until you start cooling the temperature down. Slowly reduce the temperature over about a week and a half. And then once you're down to into brumation, essentially what you're doing is you're keeping them in a dark, cool place. You don't really want to handle them. You don't want to mess with them at all. You just kind of want to shelve them for the whole time. And then you go in pretty much every week and change the water, make sure they have fresh water. And they don't really go to the bathroom because they're not eating. They're just kind of sitting there doing nothing through the whole brumation. All right, so the 8th point is the end of brumation, and you'll be surprised that if you actually shelve your snakes, put them into hibernation for about 3 months, that most of them won't hardly lose any weight. It's pretty amazing that they don't actually lose weight during brumation. And when they come out of brumation, some people increase the temperature really fast. Some people tend to raise it really slowly over a course of several days to actually bring them up. And I would say you'd probably want to bring them up to temperature and wait a few days so they can get equilibrated before you actually feed them for the very first time. And then essentially what you want to do is you want to feed them real heavy and then start pairing them up. That is like the end of brumation is pretty much the trigger for breeding for a lot of your colubrids. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Dave James asks, will my female ball python lay eggs even if I don't breed her? And that is a very good question. I would say in most cases, 99.9% of the time, you won't get eggs from your ball python if you don't pair them up. I've had a lot of ball pythons females that I didn't pair up on the off season, and they've never laid any eggs. Versus some reptiles, I know some reptiles will just keep laying eggs nonstop, kind of like a chicken. Chickens will just keep laying eggs every single day, even without a mate, and they won't be fertile, but they'll still lay eggs. It's not really the same with ball pythons, but they can actually, you may be surprised to know that ball pythons can actually lay fertile eggs without a male, which is pretty incredible. It's called parthenogenesis, and essentially what it is it's actually an identical clone to the female. I've seen it happen in a few cases. It's pretty rare, and a lot of times if you actually do go through parthenogenesis with ball pythons, a lot of times the hatchlings will have some physical problems that you'll run into, some deformities and stuff like that. It's kind of an interesting process, but I'd say, and for the most part, if you buy a female ball python as a pet, you really won't get any eggs. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.